Gary Lineker is set to leave the BBC after Sunday's final match of the day of the season. That's rather than staying on to present the FA Cup and the 2026 World Cup.
Gary Lineker, England legend, liberal social elite, and anti-Semite?
I know where I stand on this. I'm sorry, it's more important than what the BBC, what's going on there is, you know, the mass murder of thousands of children is probably something that we should have a little opinion on.
This big-eared, crisp-eating nice guy of football has found himself in trouble over some comments he's made about Gaza recently. He's been quite critical of the way that certain states have essentially turned starvation into a weapon in the Gaza Strip.
And I can't think of anything that I've seen worse in my lifetime. The constant images of children losing their lives day in, day out.
This has caused his rather unceremonious exit from Match of the Day and the BBC as a whole. Is this fair though? Would Gary be more at home in the Third Reich than he would be at the BBC? Let's see what he actually said and see if it was actually that bad. This is not the first time Gary's picked up a card for his political views. He likes politics almost as much as he likes Leicester City, or his brother likes money laundering.
And they all lost their money, which that was the low point, because, you know, they invested in the belief, and obviously investment's a gamble anyway. But.
If you know anything about Gary, you'll know he doesn't actually like his brother too much. You might also know he likes to make comments on Twitter to conservative politicians. Quite honestly, most of this stuff is the most mug-toast centre-left stuff that you've ever seen. To say it's controversial is almost a joke in itself. Most of this stuff is just the typical views of an aging progressive social liberal at the BBC. He's arguing with the type of guys who believe that COVID was caused by 5G towers and still watch daytime TV.
Everybody has an opinion on what is going on at the moment, and I'm sure he has the same opinion. Obviously, what a lot of people don't agree with is because he's being paid by the taxpayer, and I think that's where it all is come out, really. That's what I think a lot of people are against.
That's not to say there aren't some notable people who've disagreed with Gary. A number of BBC colleagues have criticised his entwining of political and social statements in with his commentary. More specifically, they complain that it violates the BBC impartiality guidelines on political broadcasting. If you're American, you've probably never heard the words impartial and media used in the same sentence before. It basically means that if you work at the BBC, you're not supposed to comment on political parties or issues, in your personal capacity anyway. Let Gary describe what he actually thought his role in this was.
Why did I have to be impartial?
So you saw yourself as a freelancer, and therefore
I am a freelancer,
and therefore not bound by the impartiality rules of the news and current affairs.
The impartiality rules were for people in news and current affairs. They have subsequently changed.
Now, the Beebs always defended Gary, saying that because he's a sportscaster, he doesn't actually have to abide by those same impartiality rules as the others do. My view personally is that his status and position as the highest earner, and probably best known household name, has probably made the treatment of him better than it would be for other talent. Let's be real, this organisation does not have a good history of regulating its employees' behaviour.
Do you like it down here on Earth?
What's he saying?
He senses an evil presence.
He senses an evil presence?
Yes.
Who could that be?
It might seem that the BBC have been a bit more arsey about this in the past 5 years, and it's because they have. In 2020, Conservative government shill Tim Davies was put in charge. One of his specific goals was to cut down on perceived wokery, inappropriate statements, and generally steer discourse on government affairs. Now I'll leave you to decide whether he did a good job with that or not.
No, as editor-in-chief, you take responsibility of the output.
So it was his fault?
Sorry?
So it was his fault?
Yeah,
The result of Davey and the guidelines that he imposed would come back to bite Gary in the arse in 2023. If you're into football, you probably remember that Gary was conspicuously absent from Match of the Day on the weekend of 11th and 12th of March. The Beeb ran the show that weekend without any hosts, thankfully saving us from Jermaine Genius.
There's no way Spurs deserve to do that.
You don't win games by having possession.
No, we know that, but listen, Spurs have dominated that game.
Possession-wise.
Chelsea were on the back foot for the majority of that.
You've got a Chelsea team who are playing against the best defensive team in the league and they've scored 4 goals. You can't say they don't deserve to win.
This was because most of them had essentially went on strike due to the treatment of Gary Lineker by the BBC over comments he'd made about the government's messaging on migrant boat crossings. Well-known idiot Suella Braverman had put out a video on stopping migrant boat crossings. Lineker disagreed with this. He compared the message to the type of thing that the Austrian painter and his lads used to say in 1930s Germany.
You think back to barely 2 years ago when you responded to a video from a Home Secretary saying, "Good heavens, this is beyond awful," and then you responded to another Twitter user by saying her language was not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s. Do you regret saying those things publicly?
I don't regret saying them publicly in terms because I was right what I said, it was accurate. But I wouldn't do it again because of all the kerfuffle that followed. And I love the BBC and I didn't like the damage that it did to the BBC.
This exchange between Gary and Suella really blew up into something that neither of them could control. People called to cancel him and remove him from his position by the type of politicians who were supposedly opposed to cancelling and removing people from their positions. Lineker stood by his statement and basically refused to wind it back.
We chat after. Cheers. Anything about the tweet, Gary? Do you regret sending the tweet at all?
No. Do you stand by what you said?
Sorry?
Do you stand by what you said in your tweet?
The BBC put out a statement and said he'd essentially breached those impartiality guidelines we talked about before. This brings us back to that walkout we talked about before. The mass walkout resulted in a jarring, stilted broadcast of Match of the Day that basically just played the match highlights with zero commentary in between. It was kind of like watching one of those like Indian streams of Premier League games where you don't know what the fuck's going on because they're playing like Eurodance in the background. This strike kind of worked, and in the end Lineker and the BBC put out a joint statement essentially saying that Lineker would now toe the line.
Gary Lineker responded on the platform where this furore began, and in a series of tweets he said,
"I'm delighted that we have navigated a way through this. I want to thank you all for the incredible support."
Adding that he is
immeasurably proud to work with the best and fairest broadcaster in the world.
And finished off the thread with this final thought.
However difficult the last few days have been, it simply doesn't compare to having to flee your home from persecution or war to seek refuge in a land far away.
Lineker continued to make a few tweets here and there, but nothing major. And then on 7th of October in 2023, something happened in Israel and Gaza that you might have heard about. This video is not about who was where first or who was promised what thousands of years ago. This video is about Gary and the BBC, so try and be civil in the comments. Gary's been quite outspoken on the topic of Israeli occupation of Gaza since 2023, particularly their treatment of the Gazan population since the ceasefire declaration.
How would you describe what's happening in Gaza? What language would you use?
It's the worst thing I've seen in my lifetime. I've seen so many images of children that, you know, I've got no skin in this game. You know, I'm not Muslim. I'm you know, not Jewish. I'm not Israeli. I'm not Palestinian. So I see it, I think, purely from the outside, as from a neutral perspective. And I can't think of anything that I've seen worse in my lifetime.
This is standard fare for Lineker in the past 2 years, but he unfortunately made one big mistake, or a big statement depending on your view, by neglecting to notice a rat emoji in the video title, or next to it. The rat symbol had been previously used as a way to refer to the IDF and Israel and Gaza, and throughout history. It was taken as an anti-Semitic statement by the BBC hierarchy and some political circles.
Actually, the BBC announcing that Gary Lineker will be leaving the corporation now, sooner than originally planned. It's understood that bosses considered his position untenable after he posted an image on social media that was considered to be anti-Semitic.
It should be known that Lineker was already committed to leaving the BBC prior to this. He suggested in an interview that this was to do with wanting to focus on his Goalhanger podcast media business, but he does also suggest that he was pressured into it by the BBC hierarchy.
You don't need to leave. The show's doing well, it's rating well, you're up for it, you enjoy it, you're good at it.
Well, perhaps they want me to leave.
Is that a sense you've got?
There was a sense of that, yeah.
But would you have stayed if you could have stayed? Would you have liked to have stayed?
No, I always wanted one more contract. I think it was their preference that I didn't do much of the day for one more year.
Is Gary straight out in Nuremberg, or is this all a mistake? Lineker's definitely a critic of Israel, but I think with his cultivated liberal elite image that he has, he wouldn't intentionally put something like this out there. I think it's just a mistake.
It's beyond me that anyone could judge someone by their faith, judge someone by the colour of their skin. It just does not make sense to me. So I can't speak for Muslims in terms of how it is for them, because I honestly don't know. I'm a middle-aged white bloke.
This might get me labelled as an anti-Semite, but I'd like to defend Gary on this. I think it was just a dumb mistake of a man in his mid-60s who's seen something on Facebook and Instagram, and he's just hit share without reading the description. I don't think he's going full DEFCON like Kanye West.
I'm not going to say what race, what people, doctor, and what hospital, and what media it went to. We know I can't say that. It was a Jewish doctor.
Gary presented his last match of the day in May 2025. They decided not to renew his contract for the FA Cup or World Cup footage either.
Last week, I shared a post here on Instagram that contained an emoji that has awful connotations. Unfortunately, I did not see the emoji. If I had, I would never, ever have shared it. The minute I was made aware, I quickly deleted the post and went on to make an apology. I would like, once again, to say I'm sorry, unreservedly, for the hurt and upset caused. It was a genuine mistake and oversight, but I should have been more diligent.
Really, he's just unlucky that the particular nation he's criticising has a very noted influence upon our media. No, I do not believe that there is a global Jewish elite that wants to enslave us. Yes, I do think that they have a disproportionate amount of influence due to the amount of money that they donate to the government and other institutions. But I don't want to visit for Mossad, so let's just leave that there. Needless to say, we're probably not going to see Gary at the BBC for much longer, if ever again.
It's been an absolute privilege to have hosted Match of the Day for a quarter of a century. It's been utterly joyous. I'd like to wish Gabby, Mark and Kelly all the very best when they sit in this chair. The programme is in the best of hands. And my final thank you goes to all of you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for all your love and support over the years. It's been so special, and I'm sorry that your team was always on last. Time to say goodbye.
Also paid a tribute to Gary Lineker.
What's next for Leicester's favourite son? I think that Lineker's been pushed out in general, but I also think he's tried to speed the decision along. He cares more about his podcasting these days, and I think it shows in his interviews.
I think I'll probably focus more on the podcast world, because it's such a fun business, and it's just been so incredible. But I'll travel a bit more, I'll have a bit more time, I'll have weekends off, so little weekend trips away.
I think the BBC moderation over the last few years has probably coloured his view of it quite negatively. I think he's been trying to leave for a while. My own hot take for remaining on the payroll for the World Cup and Euros was down to one thing, and that's that the BBC could subsidise his Rest is Football podcast and gain direct access to the things that the World Cup and Euros represent. You know, like connections with the players, with the staff, with the fans, blah, blah. Connections are important in media. That's why Gary has a mansion and I'm talking to you through my fucking cell phone. I'm not saying the guy's a leech or anything, but it just seems a sensible business move to have the B below the overhead of his own business. And frankly, I think this will piss him off more than anything else. Is Gary an anti-Semite? Probably not. At least not in my view. Anyways, give me a like, comment, tell me what you think.
There's no more Mr. Nice Guy.